Hello and welcome to the second of our lectures on the court system. Today we're just going to do a real quick conversation about how justices make up their mind. So you've seen the videos about the processes of the court, about how things like conference works, how they come up with their decisions, the idea that cases can be affirmed, overturned, or remanded, right? But so the question that we should start asking ourselves then is, okay, if all these processes are in place and there are all these things that are going on as the justices are gathering information and legal arguments about the cases they're deciding, how do they actually decide? Well, I'm going to split this into two sections. One about how they decide what cases they are going to review, and then how they make their final decision once they've heard a case's argument. So let's talk about case selection. Well, really, when we talk about case selection for the justices, they're not necessarily looking for justice, right? Now, that's not how we think about this at all, right? We think about the idea as, we're going to appeal something to the Supreme Court, right, because justice has not been served. Someone has been convicted of a crime they didn't commit, or someone has been required to pay a fine that they didn't, that was not legal. Well, the thing is that that's not what the justices are necessarily looking for. What they're looking for are cases that allow them to create standards for interpretation of particular kinds of situations and other kinds of case law. They're trying to identify characteristics that will help them get to particular policy preferences. So, for example, some of the classic cases that have come around in the last 50 or 60 years, particularly in the idea of rights of the accused, right? So the Miranda warning comes from a case called Miranda v. Texas. And the thing is that it is often held up as this, amazing example of justice finally being served, right, for this person who was stuck in jail in Texas and couldn't get legal representation, and used the penitentiary's law library to write their own petition for a writ of certiorari in pencil, right? Like, that's this big deal. But here's the reality. The justices on the Warren Court at the time had been looking for a case that would allow them to expand the rights of the accused in terms of things like what are people who've been accused of a crime, what are their constitutional rights? And so that's what they were looking for. And it just turns out that that particular case fit a set of criteria that allowed them to talk about that issue. And so they're also then, because that's what they're doing, right, they're looking for cases that have details in them that are widely applicable to other cases, right? So one of the things that's important is that when the court is going to change something big, right, they want to make sure that they've got a case that helps other courts to make a decision based on that same legal justification, right? So Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas was actually a set of cases that all kind of worked together to talk about school segregation. The same is true for the Obergefell case that legalized same-sex marriage across the country, right? What justices are looking for when they decide whether or not to take a case is how that case impacts the kinds of legal issues they want to help interpret, and whether that case will be broadly applicable. Now, once they have chosen that case, once they've agreed to hear that case, then things work a little bit differently, right? So you remember from the earlier video that they hear oral testimony for about 30 minutes on each side, depending on the case. But generally speaking, if it came on a writ of certiorari, if it came on appeal, then that's how they do it. And in that case, then, when they're trying to figure out the case outcome, their first goal is to see their own preference their own policy preference ingrained into law. But here's the thing. When we think about policy preferences, we're thinking in the context of politics and things like that. And it's slightly different when we're talking about the legal system, right? So when we talk about policy preferences, we're talking about legal policy, right? So there may be cases in which a justice may say, well, what I'm trying to accomplish is that people should interpret the Second Amendment in this way, right? That's a policy preference, which is different than a candidate who would say, my policy preference is to pass gun control laws or to make sure no gun control laws are passed, right? So it's a slightly different, we should look at, or we should think about policy preference as slightly different. And their goals, the goals that they're seeking is that there's particular things they want to accomplish in each decision, right? Remember, that's one of the benefits or one of the drawbacks, depending on your perspective, of having justices sit for life, is that they've got sort of a long time to think through what these policy preferences are and how they're going to get there. Now, we have to remember in our conversations about how justices make decisions that they are not making those decisions in a vacuum. While we largely try to separate them from policy conversations, they have strategic considerations that deal with not simply their policy preferences, but their relationship to the other people on the court and to the reputation of the court. Right? One of the things that we have to remember about the court, while it's very powerful, it has no executive power. It can't enforce its own decisions. And so one of the ways that the court keeps its power is by making sure that the decisions that it makes are widely accepted among the population, because it has to be the executive branch who will enforce their decisions. So they have some strategies, including the way I would think about it is interdependent choices. So an individual's action is in part a function of their expectation about the actions of others. So it's entirely possible, right, that a person who is tasked with writing the majority opinion may write it in such a way that it will either encourage or discourage people from joining it, right? And at the end of the day, they tend to have what we think of as multiple preferred outcomes. So often the justices, as they are talking to one another, because remember, these decisions get crafted in a group. They're not individuals, right? They get crafted together. Now, one may write the majority decision, but other people have to either sign off on it or say they're not going to sign it, which means there has to be negotiation about how things are written. But the justices are looking to maximize their preferred outcomes, recognizing that they're going to be here a long time. So that it may make more sense to take a little bit less than you want at this stage in order to get going. So what does that mean? Well, the best example of this is Brown. Remember, we talked about this when we talked about civil rights. The Brown decision was unanimous, and it was important that it be unanimous so that it would be accepted by lots of people in the country. Well, in order to do that, they had to sort of tone down some of the ways that they were talking about the inequality of desegregation and what those plans would look like, which is why they had to come and do Brown 2 the next year, because they hadn't talked about the speed with which desegregation should happen, because they couldn't all agree on it. And so that's one way to think about how that happens. I think the other piece of this and understanding how cases are decided is the institutional structure of the court itself. So, right, it's the speaking order and conference, which you learned about in the other video, right? Like, it's about seniority, and you don't want to repeat what other people have said, and you're trying to figure out how to make your case with people who are, some of the smartest legal minds in the country. And it's about the opinion writing, the actual writing of that opinion, and getting 5 people to sign on to it. So it's about strategic consensus. And it's also about who is the swing justice, right? They talk about that a lot, because there does seem to be a pretty significant um, difference in groups of the justices in terms of their legal policy preferences. There's a group that seems to be more liberal and a group that seems to be more conservative. But interestingly, the most important piece of this is that they need to worry about the reputation of the court. And so in a lot of cases, John Roberts, who is policy-wise definitely a conservative, will make decisions that help to protect the integrity of the court, right? To help protect the court's ability to make certain kinds of decisions, to help make sure that the court has the autonomy that it needs in order to continue to be the interpreter of the Constitution. And at the end of the day, man, judicial independence is a big deal. Lots and lots of justices have been appointed to the Supreme Court and have then changed their legal philosophy and opinions on things, mostly because they have the ability to do that. They've got their whole job is to think through these issues and think through these legal precedents. So the end of this conversation about how justices decide leads us into the whole idea of what the court is doing when it makes decision about what the Constitution says and about how to interpret the laws of Congress or the decisions of lower courts. And that's the function of judicial review. And you're going to see a video about Marbury versus Madison, which is the first real test of whether the court actually has the power to interpret the Constitution. And then we'll talk a little bit more about judicial review and policy making in the next video.